Session management. We have pretty well understood that cookies are used for managing state of a client which we do not want other clients to view. And the solution is perfect for the simple reason that the state is not stored on the server but it is stored on the client machine only in memory or on disk based on whether it is non-persistent or persistent cookie. But in practical, there are situations where we cannot store data on the client machine. One can be we have got large volume of data and cookies have limit in terms of their size and number. Two, the value of a cookie is always supposed to be string. But sometimes we may not want to store string, but it might be in some other format. Maybe I would like to have complete data set itself being shared by requests from the same client. So in these kind of cases, we'll have to go for HTTP sessions. So what is a session? A session is an object created on server and it has got key value pairs which are managing data on behalf of a given client. That means session also serves the same purpose which cookies serve. The only basic difference is sessions are on server. They are not created or saved on client. They are created and saved on server only. So when is the session actually created? And how long does the session exist? And what kind of data we can store in the session? Very important, whenever a browser is going to submit the request for the first time, the web application on the server is going to create a session on behalf of that web browser or let us say client. Basically, it creates an object on behalf of that client. And beautifully, it remembers that object so that the same object can be reused for subsequent request. That means, in the first request, if inside a session a key value pair is saved, that key value pair is going to be available in subsequent request by the client. Oh yes, very true. How does it overcome the HTTP protocol stateless issue? As per HTTP protocol, nothing should be retained on server and everything should be forgotten about the client. So how is that HTTP server remembers for this particular client, this is the session object to be used, because for every client we will have a separate object created. And once the response is rendered, the information about the client is lost. So the big question arises, among multiple session objects which are existing on server, which is the most appropriate session object to be used for a given client? Rather, which is the session object, not appropriate, only one belongs to a particular client. If none belongs to the particular client, we have understood it automatically creates a new session. Yes, this is one point which we have to understand. And the other point we have to understand is how long is that object going to exist in server? Because if the number of objects are exceeding with the increasing number of clients, the load on server is exceeding and that can lead to crash. So what is the solution in this kind of problem? Yes, there is a predefined amount of time the session object is going to remain valid on server. By default, that is 20 minutes. That is referred as session timeout. So every session once created is created for a minimum period of, let us say, 20 minutes by default. So for 20 minutes, that object is going to remain on server and can behave like a container for multiple key value pairs, which for the client can be reused in subsequent request. But then what is the answer to the previous question? How does server know this is the request for which this is the session object? How is that request to session mapping is done on server? What actually happens is whenever a browser submits a request on server, creating a new session object also leads to assigning an ID to that is referred as session ID. Server in the form of session ID creates a cookie and writes that to the browser. And that cookie is a non-persistent cookie. It is only remembered by the browser's memory. So now, subsequently, whenever a browser is submitting the request, automatically that cookie will get included along with the request. Yes. And that cookie is what is used by ASP.NET on server to identify what is the appropriate session object to be used. So can I say sessions are dependent on cookies? Yes. As of now, we can say that sessions are indeed dependent on cookies. We do not have alternative. But yes, going forward, we will see that there are alternatives to sessions. Instead of making there are alternatives to cookies. Instead of making a session dependent on cookie, we can have better alternatives if required. And of course, everything has pros and cons we are going to discuss. So yes, let us once again read this. A session is an object on server having key value pairs created on server on behalf of a given client. This object is created on the first request from the client, and the same object is reused for all subsequent requests by that client. The object is created and reused. That is very important. The key value pair is of type string and object. Key is of type string, value is of type object. Hence, in session, we can store any kind of data, unlike in cookies where we can store only strings. All sessions can store any amount of data, and we have unlimited number of key value pairs. The limitations which we had in cookies, we do not have in session. But of course, you should not always try to store large amount of data for a long duration in session, because that would require a lot of memory on the server. Or because of the extra memory requirement, the performance of the server might go down. So though theoretically there is no limit, it is never recommended to store large amount of data in session. When a new session is created, a unique ID is assigned to it, and the same is rendered in the form of non-persistent cookie in the response. With all subsequent requests, the browser includes this cookie, and ASP.NET uses it to decide which session object to be used for that particular client request. That is the beauty of it. From a list of session objects which are existing already on server, which session object should be used by a particular client, that mapping is done with the help of cookie, and we know that cookie of one client cannot be used by another client. Then the other part, that is timeout period, is defined for every session. The default value is 20 minutes. Now what is the significance? This 20 minutes is actually the sliding expiration. Suppose the session remains unused for 20 minutes on the server, the session object is automatically destroyed. But within the 20 minutes, if the client is going to submit a request, automatically from the last request, next 20 minutes, the timeout is extended. So yes, a session is always going to get created and remain on server for a minimum period of timeout. Even if the client closes the browser, very important thing. I submit one request, a session object is created on my behalf on server, and immediately I close the browser. That will not destroy the session object on server. Why? Server would never know that the browser is closed on the client machine. Server would wait for next 20 minutes only if the request does not receive, if the server does not receive the request from the same client for next 20 minutes, then the server object is destroyed, but not immediately. Of course, as a developer, we can write code, programming we can do, and use session.abandon. And that is going to generate a response which will destroy the cookie on the client. Hence, subsequent request will automatically create a new session, and old session will get garbage collected, will get destroyed. So using session.abandon, we can explicitly destroy the session for subsequent request. That means in subsequent request, a new session will be created. So all that data which was stored in the previous session is going to be lost. Nothing remains in memory. And then we also have remove all. The difference between remove all and abandon is, Abandon for subsequent request will create a new session object and new subkey value pairs have to be added. Whereas session.remove all is only going to remove all the data from the session but will not recreate a new session for the subsequent request. Existing session object only will be reused, but the data will be cleared from memory. So this explains pretty well. Client submits a request, let us say for page 1, one action method that writes to the session. Then the client submits the request through ASP.NET for page 2. Thick line. Thick line is first client. Dashed line is second client. So from session 1 only, page 2, let us say action method 2 is going to pick up the data. So from whichever client the data is stored in session, from same client if the request comes, maybe for another action method of the same controller or a different action method of a different controller, the same session object is going to be reused. Let us now look at this particular concept with a proper example. So I'll create now, let us say a new project I'll create so that we don't have confusion with cookies project. Sessions demo app. I go to home controller, index method. Now here what I'll do is I'll use session API. Now to refer to the session, we have got session is the property which is of type HTTP session state. Actually HTTP session state base is the parent of HTTP session state. We are interested in session of some key, let's say some count. If is equal to null implies what? Session is not yet having that key. Maybe this was the first request and that key is not there. Well, should be double quotes. So now what I'll do is in this session variable, session of CNT, that's one variable, I'll put n, or let us do it this way. Integer n is equal to 0 if is not equal to null, we will take from session the value, cast it to integer, because earlier we have stored integer only. Now what? If n is equal to 0, then if the session variable is there, not equal to null, take the value. Otherwise n will remain 0. In either case, increment n. And the increment value, let us put it back into the session. And this value we would like to use in view. So copy this. In view I go to now. And I give session count at the rate session of CNT. Let's run this. First request from this browser, first request. So this will be null. So it will not go here. N was 0, it becomes 1. So N1 now is going to be viewed in browser 1. Now I refresh, press F5 on the keyboard, refresh. 2, 3. Every time I refresh, it's incrementing. Why is it incrementing? Simple reason. Every time now it goes to server. On server, it will find that the session is already existing for this particular client. And because the session is already existing, it will not create a new one. And from that session, it will take the value of CNT and that value is incremented. And that value is again stored in the session for it to be viewed in browser as it is. So I go back to browser, refresh, 7, 8, copy this URL, go to another browser, maybe Internet Explorer, and you'll see that it again starts with 1 here. Why? Because for this browser a separate session is created on server, and this browser will have its own non-persistent cookie, and this browser will have its own non-persistent cookie, which is the session ID. So this increments, go back here, this will continue from 9, 10, 11, 12, this will continue on its own. So what basically it means is, for every browser we will have a separate session created on server. Very important thing, right now for I it is 6. Now let us close I and we'll start new instance of I. Go back to same server and you'll find 1. It will not be 6. Why? Simple reason, the old instance was hosting the non-persistent cookie in memory. So on closing that browser, that non-persistent cookie is destroyed. So when I started a new browser, it went to server without a cookie and a new session got created on behalf of this particular I instance. So what happened to that session object earlier? Server is going to now wait for 20 minutes for that object to be destroyed. Only after 20 minutes that object is going to be destroyed, not before that. So this is how session object is created and managed. See, so simple API. Session of key dot, equal to value. Value is of type object, key is of type string. So I believe with this you have clear understanding of what is a session. Session is an object created on server and is going to have multiple key value pairs which are going to be local to a particular client and not shared with others. 2. A session has created a non-persistent cookie. So if the browser is closed, the cookie is automatically going to get destroyed, and after a timeout period on server, that session object is going to be destroyed. So to manage session, we have a property called as session, through which we can manage the key value pair. Session is of type HTTP session state. Actually speaking, the object is of type HTTP session state, but the variable is of type HTTP session state base. A base is an abstract class. HTTP session state is a proper object. Is the object created. And we have already seen from different browser, we are going to get different sessions. That's all in this. Thank you.